So, first, just so you know who I am, because it just says Anita in the thing. I'm Anita Hackstuhl. I work as an art director for other studios and for my own studio, Sunscorch Studios. I founded with a bunch of other people together. I don't know if any of you know them. We'll see in a second if you recognize any of the games we've made. But what you'll know is that I just became an art director by accident, and I'm going to walk you through how that happened in a moment. So what I've worked on, I have no idea if you will recognize any of these, because as you might realize, the indie scene is quite big and there's a lot of niche titles. So despite being commercially viable as a studio, our reach isn't as big as some of the AAA guys you might have seen in these talks before. We worked on a bunch of games. The entire side of this screen, I don't know if you can actually see my cursor or not, is games. This is TV shows and learning, so 2D animation, 3D animation, and the middle is tools. So I've dabbled in kind of a bit of everything throughout my career. The graveyard of cancelled and still under NDA project is a lot bigger than 2 titles, which you'll get familiar with once you start your journey in the industry, I have no doubt. So initially, I didn't want to be an art director. I wanted to be a tech artist. I started with computer science, and I wanted to do programming. I was like, this is too technical for me. So I started doing art in my free time, and I switched over to art. So I wanted to combine the two. Great, so the path, I was in university like you guys were, and I was like, okay, so what is the path to becoming a tech artist? You get your degree, you find an internship or an entry-level position, you ship your first game, you eventually get promoted to mid-level, and then you're successful, right? And you're in the industry, you've made it. So that's not quite how it turned out. So when I finished my degree, the pandemic had just hit. And yes, there was a lot of positions in games, but not a lot of entry-level stuff. It was all senior. And travel wasn't permitted, so there was no way for me to get a travel visa to go to the US where there was more jobs or anything like that. And at the same time, we accidentally created a bit of a media echo with one of the portfolio projects we've made. So what instead happened is I founded a game studio with random people I knew from the internet. That kind of came out of nowhere. And we decided to make a plan. This is something that you'll become familiar if you ever go into indie dev instead of AAA. And that is the absolute chaos that is everything before actual production happens. So we set out to do a plan. It's like, okay, this random project kind of blew up in the media, so we now need to make a proper thing out of it. Started making a vertical slice. We were going to pitch to publishers, eventually sign an agreement, make the game, and become a viable company. Sounds easy? It's not. We made the vertical slice, we pitched to publishers. We pitched to publishers for 6 months, I think. We got rejected for various reasons, some more ridiculous than others. There was literally some that rejected us because our game wasn't finished, which was a fun one. So what we did was we made a new demo, because that's what you do, right? You change things, you change up the concept, you change up the quality, you change up everything you can to make it more attractive. You pitch it again, and you try to get a deal. We did the same thing again. It came out much better than before, by a lot. Still no deal, because that was when the Embracer weirdness happened and no one was actually signing projects. So at this point, it was no longer dependent on what we were pitching. It was just, we don't sign anything that has a budget bigger than like 200,000. Great, so we were like, do we do another vertical slice? Does that make sense? Do we do the same thing again? Or do we make a different game? Because at this point we had people, right? So you want to take care of your people? We were at this point 10 people. And we were like, so what do we do with those 10 people if we don't get something signed soon? You gotta fire them. Roller coaster? We got a bit of a surprise break there. Ended up with venture capital. So now we're actually funded, but we had to sign away part of the company. That's the trade-off, right? So if you go for security, you gotta give up something. If you go with a publisher, sometimes it's your IP, it's a part of your profit, or with venture capital, it's a part of your company. And we were initially going to make another vertical slice with that investor on board, but we pivoted halfway through that development because it turned out that wasn't viable either. The situation hadn't really improved on the market, and we were like, we're just going to make our own game and self-publish that. Because that's so much easier than going with a publisher that knows what they're doing, right? Just do it all yourself. So we ended up making 2 different games. And we've published one of them now, which is the Rat Shaker one you've seen, and the other one is an early access. So, yeah, it's a bit of a roller coaster to get into game dev immediately and go into indie, especially because we did it while we're still doing our degrees. So if any of you decide to found a studio, I would recommend not doing it while you're still in the middle of trying to get through a full-time course. Not a fun experience. But yes, so that's kind of where I come from and what happened. Throughout that process, I, instead of becoming a tech artist, became an art director. I had the quote up in the beginning. I just complained until someone put me in charge, and that kind of was what happened, where we didn't have any kind of quality control, any sort of pipeline, anything like that. I was just a person to step up, and that's how it just became my role. But now that I have that out of the way, and we've actually talked about me, so you know where I am, where I'm coming from, what my background is, and with what context to take what I'm telling you. Like, I've never managed teams that are bigger than like 30 people. So anything that I tell you might not be as applicable if your team is bigger than that. But if your team's smaller than 30 people, if you're doing it with like 5 people, with 10, 15, that's where I'm very comfortable, and that's where I've gotten all of my experience. So just take it with a grain of salt if you're in a very different context, because context is very important with everything, especially communication. So what we're going to look at is what happens if we have bad communication. If we look at surveys, because there's no real way to measure this objectively, so we have to look at surveys for this, right? 86% of employees think that ineffective communication is the main cause of all their issues. And I would wager that's mostly accurate based off my own experience, although that is anecdotal. Because most of the time when something goes wrong, it is not that the person you're working with is incompetent, it's that they didn't understand what was being asked of them, that they were too afraid to ask for clarification, that there was a weird phrasing, that there was a misunderstanding, right? It's usually not that the people you work with don't know what they're doing, it's that they don't know how to communicate what they're doing. And this is especially important in games, and I've seen a lot of weirdness there. So the bigger number even is 97% of employees think communications impact their task efficacy. So this means most people are aware of it, but very rarely is something done about it. So I'm pretty sure if you've ever worked a job before or have like a side hustle or anything like that, you will be familiar with having an annoying client or a boss that seems like they don't know what they want because they can't communicate what they want. They'll just be like, we want something happy and fun. And you're like, what is happy and fun in design terms? Or we want it as soon as possible. And you're like, what is as soon as possible? I don't know when that is. So it's very common, especially in the creative sector, to get people trying to formulate what they want something to feel like into a proper task, right? The main point as well is that not having good communication erodes trust in the team. So if you're not able to communicate clearly what you want or what you expect, people are going to fail at meeting those expectations, and that's going to breed resentment and trust issues. But what does good communication get us? On average, people report about 30% performance increase. That is a subjective number, that is not an objective number, right? But that's what people feel happens. So at least we can tell they feel good about this. The only metrics we kind of have on this subject is what their producers tell us, right? What they see in their Jira boards and how that improves. And on average, you can save about 8 hours. Technically, you round down to 7 hours here, but yes, you can 7.5 hours a week you can save in employee time, which would be great. By just not having to talk multiple times, by just not having to run back and forth all the time. And you gain back your employee trust, because they can now trust that when you give them a task and they do it, they're not going to get scolded for doing what you thought you wanted them to do. And I phrase this all in part as employees because that's the shortest way to do it. This applies to any team member if they're a freelancer, and even if they're an external client or an outsourcing vendor, right? So, how do we fail? What is stuff that we commonly do wrong and that you see all the time? One of the most common ones I see is people are just casually asking about something like, hey, can you get me this by tomorrow? Right? That's a very common sentence. Maybe in passing, you say that to someone that's still working on their PC, probably on another task. So why is this an issue? The one good thing about it is it has a deadline, which is great. We know when we need it by. But it doesn't clearly assign who's responsible. So let's say you walk past 2 people. Which one of them did you address? Did you just casually look at one and hope they were registering which one of them you were looking at? Right? There's no precise deadline, as in like tomorrow end of day, beginning of the day. Do you have like a meeting that it needs to be done for? Anything like that would be really interesting and important to know. It doesn't explicitly mention or recap the task, or in this case, the ask, because asks include everything that's not a proper task as well. This will really lead to issues down the line, because if that person wasn't listening to everything you said before, let's say you had a conversation with someone else, and you're just turning around going like, hey, can you get me this by tomorrow? They'll be like, well, what exactly? We talked about a bunch of things. Another way we fail is like this. So if you say, I need you to quickly whip up something for me, let's sit down and sort it. So far, this is a much more immediate thing, right? You're offering guidance to them, you're going to sit down with them. This is much more involved. It's less of just a comment in passing and more of a actual interaction. So good thing about it is it offers guidance, but the main problem is that it doesn't respect the team members' time. You're not asking them, do you actually have time for this, right? Or are you having something more important going on right now? You interrupt their current task, and you don't mention the main task at hand so they can make an educated decision, right? So let's say you ask them to change a single variable. They might be able to do that quickly for you and with you. But if you're asking to rework an entire system or create an entire asset from scratch, that is a very big task that they might have to either talk to a producer about when to schedule it, or that they might have to do after their high priority task they're working on is done. This example is a bit different. So this is the response, right? Someone's like, I'll get this to you as soon as I'm able to. And then they just go on with what their plans were with, hey, are we still on for lunch today? Right? It happens quite often that people remember something else as they talk about something that's important to them. You talk about a task you do, and then you remember, oh, right, lunch is coming up. Are we still doing that? And in a casual conversation, this wouldn't be an issue, but when we're communicating tasks, it is an issue because you're distracting the person. They were trying to make a mental note or even a physical note of what they needed to do for you. And now you've added this additional thing, which especially with people who are neurodivergent can lead to even more issues because they might latch on to that last bit even more than a regular person would. It doesn't have a delivery time or estimate either, but that's something that we've commonly established already. And it doesn't have a clarification of what the deliverables are. So that's some of the ways that we commonly fail at. The last thing I'll show you is the most cliche one that anyone that works with clients gets, which I mentioned in the beginning, is doesn't look at all like what I asked for. It needs to be more exciting and fresh, which is the world's most useful feedback, obviously, that will get you everything you need added to that deliverable. So we'll go deeper into this and how to fix those issues now and how to prevent those issues from happening. I'm aware that this talk is not as image heavy and as fancy and wonderful as I imagine most of the artistic talks are. The reason why I still chose this topic is because it's extremely important and it's the #1 issue I've seen in teams and games that I've worked in or with over the years. Over the last 5 years, I've worked with about 15 different teams, and all of them had some variation of this as an issue, mostly because people that work in games go into games not because they're passionate about talking to people, but because they're passionate about making art or writing code. So while it's not priority for them most of the time, I want to just make sure that you're aware of this. So how do we do better? You've probably all had some version of this when you were taught in school how to call the police and how to call the fire brigade and get them all the info they need. We have a more specific version of this that we use here. Long checklists don't really work for short form communication, so I reduced it to the 3 Ws, which is just what, why, and what now. So it's the same kind of words, but different order, different priorities. So the important thing that everyone needs to know that you're talking to, even if it's just a casual short conversation, is what needs doing, why does it need doing, and what exactly do they need to do now? Like, what's their task that they need to work off of? If we go for an example for that, it would be, I need you to create a specific sound effect for when a building construction finishes. That's great. It tells us exactly what the context for that task is and what the task is, right? We're expecting a sound file that fits that construction. But why do I need it? So you might think, why is the why important? I just need them to do something. But because you're usually not the expert in the thing you're asking someone else for, the important thing is to let them come up with the solution, but give them your parameters that they need to match. So I might know it looks really cool if I have like a lattice-like structure going up if the building continues. But a building construction finishing could be a very thumpy sound, a very low-profile sound, unless you actually give them the context of, hey, we want this to be an additional cue for the player so they can reallocate their workers faster, right? So it's more of a notification sound than a just hammer hitting wood or something. And it should introduce itself with the current UI pop-up, which is more context that they need. So main point is what now? Like, what do you need them to do right now, which would be give you a timeline for when to expect the first iteration so that you can add to your product backlog. I don't know if you've actually talked about any agile before. It's a way that most people manage their game teams. Often they use Scrum or some other variation. But what basically happens is you put all of your tasks that you're ever going to do on a big list, and that's the product backlog. And anything that needs to be added down the line goes on that backlog. So that's just what I'm referring to here. And for a general window, I have been told that we're hoping to have it in by the end of the month, right? So you're also giving them an expectation to match their estimate to. This gives them the opportunity to say, hey, this is not realistic. this might be a bad example for this because a single sound doesn't take that long to make, but let's say you wanted them to make 15. And you're like, I can't possibly do it by the end of the month. Can we do it like this instead, or do a staggered delivery? So you give them all the context they need to make an educated estimate. For long-form communication, we actually have something much more sophisticated, which is taught in a lot of corporate contexts. So people that have a management degree or an economics degree will know this, or that have worked in really big Fortune 500 companies before. They place a lot of emphasis on this because it's more important to have rigid guidelines the bigger your organization is. But it's a common technique that you can just hang up as a checklist on your desk if you have a lot of email communication, or if you communicate online a lot because you have a remote team. That's one of the reasons I got into this, is because most of the teams I work with are remote. The main team I work with at Sunscorched is remote, fully remote. We don't have a physical office. So written communication allows for a lot more misinterpretation, especially because there's no tone, there's no facial expression, right? You'll all be familiar with misreading someone else's text really easily. So, oh, sorry, I just got a bunch of pop-ups on the screen from Teams. But yes, so we split this down into 7 different factors that you can look at when you're writing something. The first one of those is clear. It's pretty self-explanatory what clear means, but just to break it down, it's that the goal or main point of your message is clear. The person knows the action to be taken and there's no room for speculation, right? But how do we get that when we're writing a message? You would limit the length of your sentences, which is something that's especially problematic in German, but you'll kind of have to deal with it, especially because a lot of your work communication will be in English. So limiting the length of sentences is one of the easiest ways to be inclusive as well, because a lot of people will be using English as a second language, or if they move to Germany to work, they'll be using German as their second language. You will only want to use 1 point or 1 idea per sentence, paragraph, or bullet point, because else we run into the same issue we had with the example earlier, where we're like, hey, we're also still on for lunch, but you can do the same thing and have the same problem by just going like, okay, so I don't like the color of this, but also the lattice is kind of off and the sound is weird, and then it becomes weird. It's no longer clear what your main point is. Instead, you want to structure all of those as separate points and explain your point separately. We go on to concise. We get that's as short as necessary, as long as necessary. That doesn't really tell us much about how to accomplish this, though. To be concise, you have to get your point across immediately, right? This is something that a lot of people from other cultures struggle with a lot more. I have had very little issues with Germans with this. In fact, they usually get a bad rap for doing that exact thing of getting to the point immediately with no small talk. But in other cultures, that is much more important to emphasize with people. There is a lot more emphasis placed on polite small talk before you approach a point. So that is something that you need to make sure people on your team are comfortable with, right? It makes communication more effective, but it might not come as intuitively for those people. A lot of people also use a lot of filler words because they're insecure. And that is especially common with artists that are very involved in their work, right? So they will feel really insecure about asking for feedback. They will be really insecure about asking for clarification on feedback because they don't want to seem dumb. They don't want to seem like they're pushing back on you if you're giving the feedback. So getting rid of filler words doesn't just make your stuff more readable, it also encourages a more open exchange. You should also get rid of anything that isn't absolutely necessary as a point. If you don't think it's necessary, don't point it out. You also want to be concrete, which kind of plays into the previous point. These all overlap to some degree. They're just separate factors of the same thing. To do that, you want to use specific phrasing, right? Use the most precise word for the task, so long as your opposite knows that word. We don't want to be talking a language our opposite doesn't understand, but we do want to be as precise as possible. You want to use concrete metrics, as in, like, if there's, you wouldn't say, get me a few props, you would say, give me 5 props, right? So make sure that everything you do is measurable. This goes back into SMART, which I imagine you've been told to do for all of your student projects. At least I was when I was in courses. And I'd be happy to be corrected if that's wrong, and then I'll go over this in more detail. But basically, you want all of your goals to be SMART. You want all of your goals to be measurable, right? So that the person actually knows if they succeeded in doing what you asked of them. Then we go to correct, which should be the most obvious one. You don't want any factual errors, obviously, but one big thing about professional communication is that you also want it to be as devoid of grammar and spelling errors as you can manage. No one's going to fault you for not knowing how to spell a word or accidentally getting stuff wrong occasionally, but it's more about reading through your message one more time before you send it. Even if it's just a short message, even if it's just a Discord, a Teams, a Slack message, it can go a long way in preventing misunderstandings, because anyone that's ever used autocorrect knows that some typos can really change the meaning of a sentence really easily. And this seems trivial, but I see it all the time, so I just mention it explicitly. You also want to make sure that your phrasing is appropriate for your target group. I'm talking to you as university students now, but if I was holding the same talk for kids at a much younger age, or people who have worked in a very corporate context for years, that would very much change how I approach things and what language I would use. Yes. That is honestly basically it for correct. The main point with correct is to just stick with it, right? All it requires is a bunch of extra effort, but in a production environment where everything's really hectic, everyone's really stressed out, especially towards the end of a deadline, it's the one that gets dropped first. So just make an effort to keep that one, even if you're stressed out, even if you're in a rush. Coherent basically comes down to no rambling. It is something that a lot of people, let me rephrase this. There's basically 2 types of people. The ones that become very short when they're nervous or upset, and the ones that become longer and longer in their phrasing and just start rambling, right? So coherent comes down to the second type. That is one of the coping mechanisms that a lot of people have. They just keep talking if they're insecure. They want to fill that silence. And the same happens with written communication, where they will over-explain everything because they feel like they're not being precise enough, but that will actually hurt them because it will not make the point clearer, it will make it more convoluted. So what helps with that is cleanly separating your points, no mixing of different issues, what we already talked about with clear. If you're doing email communication, one issue, one email. Don't send the same email about 2 different things. The reason I'm saying this is because let's say you give feedback in that email and you also ask someone if they remembered a meeting, right? They can't delete one email and keep the other because they're about 2 completely separate issues. And the subject line wouldn't be as searchable either. So if they were searching for that meeting invite, they would probably not find it because you titled it Feedback This Asset, right? So that's one of the reasons why it is important to separate your issues when you're doing that type of communication. The same is true for back and forth communication in a messenger, where you want to at least have a separation of a paragraph in between issues. And if you're giving out tasks on a board, on a task tracker board like Jira, Trello, some people use Notion, you want to have one task, one card. You can always make as many sub-tasks as you need, right? But one task should always be one card only and not have multiple ones on it. Because that makes it really hard to track your progress on that task. You also want to structure your feedback according to the 3 Ws or the feedback pyramid, which is something we're going to talk about after this. And that basically concludes coherent. just try to make your point as coherently as possible. You will find that you struggle with these even as you know about them. Like, my communication every day is not perfect, despite being very aware of all of these principles, because we're still a bit of a slave to our instinct, and we don't always think about everything when we're doing something. Complete is the other one, which sounds pretty obvious on paper, but it's often dropped, I would say. Because a lot of the time people are like, okay, I remember all of this about this task, I'm going to get this to a person as fast as possible, but neglect to make sure that everything's in the first package, right? Oftentimes it's the first package you receive is not complete enough for you to start the task. You'll have to check back about multiple things, and then it goes back and forth for a few days, depending on how fast the communication line is. And that really, really slows things down. It's also very frustrating because you don't want to spend a bunch of days playing email ping pong. You want to get started on the task that you're doing. So once again, use the 3 Ws to make sure everything is there. Use the SMART framework to make sure everything is also measurable for that person. And make sure that all the actions you want them to take are included. Check if you could do this task with the info you've provided for the other person. Because if you could do the task with the info you've provided, chances are they can too. And also make sure that at the end of your message, if it's a long one, you include a summary, the concrete takeaways, or some sort of action plan for that person. Courteous just basically comes down to being friendly, open, and honest. That's the 3 main factors, but not without tact. It's the most difficult one to nail because this one changes with every environment you're in, depending on if the person is more corporate, if it's more impersonal and more personal. People will expect a very different way of being courteous, and that's something that you just have to figure out the first few weeks you're there and see how everyone else is doing it. But one thing that always applies is to be honest, but check for hurtful, passive-aggressive, or accusatory phrasing. It's something that really easily slides into a message without you noticing. So try to read your message and think about how it could be read if a person was maybe not in the best mindset. That's honestly the best way to check for that. Another thing is if you use posh language, which is just a British English term for using very complicated, very elitist style word choices. If you do that when giving feedback, a lot of the time people will see you as being aloof. So especially if you're giving harsh feedback, it can help to phrase it differently, to stick with that person a bit more, and to just adjust to what they would use as language to make it less harsh. Because earlier or later in your career, you're going to have some conversation with someone where you're like, okay, so this has really not hit the mark. How do we fix this? The other point is to always give your recipient the benefit of the doubt for the first response. You should always be courteous the first time around. You can always take the gloves off if they really become problematic and actually do something that warrants it, but never start the conversation off like that. Okay, so that concludes the 7 C's, and I realize that a lot of this sounds trivial on paper, but if you actually try this, if you actually hang it up somewhere in your office as a checklist, and you go through it, I think you'll realize a lot of the messages you send daily might not even comply with this. They will usually miss one or the other just because the way we message others has become so fast-paced and so casual that oftentimes we just type, hit send, and then we think about it. So this is the thing that I'm not going to go into for a long time, because I'm pretty sure that you're familiar with this, because it's a big part of planning even academic work. But yes, SMART should be applied. It is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. That is just what it is. should be what is accomplished, who's responsible for managing and for execution. That's the only thing people sometimes miss, is you don't just need to make sure that someone is responsible for making the thing, but also that someone is responsible for tracking the progress of said thing and managing the person that's doing it. What steps are necessary to achieve it, and what are the milestones? Great. What metrics can you use to measure progress? What's the definition of done? So that's another term that you might not be familiar with. Definition of done is basically what you define as the deliverable for a task. So definition of done for something that's creative work is important because you can keep improving things forever. And if you don't want to get caught in that vicious cycle, you have to have like a bar, and if it hits that bar, it's good enough. And how do we track this progress? Achievable is only important because you should always get a second opinion if you're not familiar with estimating tasks for said person or for yourself. One of the things that we always do is we always overestimate our own abilities. I do too, which is something Leon can probably sing a song about, because I was not the best at keeping up with communicating with him because I was busy and things happen, and those are all excuses because I could have managed it otherwise, I had managed my time better, right? So always make sure that you're not stretching yourself too thin by double checking with someone else, because they'll have a much better idea of if what you're saying is realistic. You might think, of course I can make those 10 assets in 10 days, and they'll be like, you'll need at least a week for each of them. And the other thing is to always use empirical data. This is something you'll only gather over time in a production. So initially, you will have to guess, basically. But you will have to track if your guesses were accurate and how long it actually took you. And then over time, you will have data how long it takes you. Let's say you need to make a chair, and a chair takes you an arbitrary amount of 5 days. Great. You now know that it's 5 days, but you estimated it would take you 3. So now you know that it took 5 instead of 3, and the next time you have to build a chair or a table or anything that's similar to this, you'll be able to go, okay, this normally takes us 5 days. The other thing is to always make sure to evaluate if you are with a team. The one thing that changes from planning your own academic work is you have the choice between reducing scope or increasing manpower. When you're on your own, you only have the choice of reducing scope, right? If you think it's not achievable in the time you have, you should either extend the timeline or reduce scope. But if you have the luxury of hiring people to fix your shortages, like a freelancer brought on for like a month just to balance that workload, or even an additional hire because you really need them, then you have to figure out whether the financial hit of hiring someone else is more important, or if the actual item you're trying to do is more important, so you actually reduce the scope. Relevant is honestly most of the same as you'll be familiar with, because it's how high priority is the task, right? How time sensitive is it? But it's also important that your entire team has an MVP, which is a minimum viable product. So this is the idea that the team has of the minimum smallest scope that is your game but shippable. Like, is it playable? Does it have the most important stuff in it? This is what you'll define at the beginning of development. And if this task is relevant for that, it's always going to be more important than one that isn't. And one thing that you also have to keep in mind is if that task has dependencies down the line or even early in the production pipeline. So let's say you need to finish an asset so you can build other assets based on that. The best example would be you need to build an environmental tile set. So stop me if you don't know what that is, because I'm not sure what your specializations are. But basically, if you build an environmental tile set, you would need that to actually populate that level with props, because you can't do that before the walls are in, before the ceiling and the floor are in, right? So that is obviously higher priority than the props themselves. Time bound is honestly exactly the same as you're used to. Nothing really changes here when you're in a team. It's still just how often do you update others on your progress? When is the task supposed to hit the definition of done? And what are your milestone deadlines? So it's exactly the same as you would be used to from planning an academic paper or a student project. So now we've talked a lot about how to ask someone to do something for you. But how do you make sure that when you give them feedback, they don't feel too bad? I mean, maybe they should feel a little bit bad if they fucked up, but otherwise they should not feel like you're reprimanding them for not meeting your internal expectations. So how do we deal with that, and how do we make sure they feel motivated to move on, to actually add what you need or remove what you wanted removed? Most important thing to realize is that game dev, like any form of art, is a very emotional endeavor for people. They attach a lot of themselves to their work, for better or for worse. But an initial filtering of your reactions is pretty important. Because a lot of the time, when someone delivers something we don't like, or something we really like, our reaction will be pretty extreme. Because we've been working on the same thing for, let's say, 5 years, and we've really attached ourselves to that project. So we have a lot of investment in it being good. The easy way to do that is to add a delay between the initial submission of the feedback and you answering it. So if your feedback is written, that is very easy. If it's spoken, that might not be as easy to do. But let's say you get a report and you look at it and you check all the details, and then you do something else for 5 minutes before you answer. That's the easiest way to prevent you from having a very emotional reaction. You could switch to written feedback. That also helps some people. Some people are really, really struggling with taking notes when you give them verbal feedback, and some people prefer it the other way around to begin with. So that is an option you can also do. And you can use the frameworks I provide you with to make sure your feedback is based on facts mostly. We will still have your own opinions in there, but we'll build them on facts. So, in general, good feedback finishes on an actionable plan. I've said this a lot when all the different points in this talk so far, but it's honestly the main takeaway, because when you give people feedback, when you give people a task, they will freeze unless you give them a point to start on, right? It's the same phenomenon as like a deer in the headlights or people seeing an emergency and just standing there not doing anything. The same can happen to people in a much more mundane context of you tell them to, let's say the most extreme example would be, I tell someone to develop a game and they'd be like, where do I start? What do I do? What game do I even make? And on a smaller scope, the same thing happens with tasks. If I just tell them to make a table, they'll be like, okay. But if I tell them, hey, I need you to make this table for this context, in this level, in this time period, and I give you a few references and I tell you when I need it by, can you give me an estimate how long that would take you, and when do you think the high poly and low poly would be done, that kind of stuff. It gives them something to start on. It gives them something concrete to latch onto. It just eases the transition from thinking about the task to executing it. You gotta cater to your audience as well here, because you will have a lot of people, at least in my experience in games, that are either neurodivergent or disabled, because the space is very accommodating to those specific needs that those people have. On our team, for example, we have people that are on the spectrum, people that are deaf, right? People that are colorblind. They all exist. They all have their own challenges. So if I tell someone that's colorblind that I don't like the color of what they did, it might not be as useful as just giving them the hex code and being like, hey, I know this is a thing that we need to fix. This is what the color needs to be brought to. And use references as much as possible. This is a very undervalued thing, but there's so many different ways of using references. There's entire books about how to direct a team on creative references. I can recommend a few if you are interested in further reading on this, but there's obviously the most simple ones are drawovers and references and graphs. Everyone knows those. But you can always give them sound bites to set the mood for a level as well. You can give them a style rangefinder, which is basically you give them a bunch of references that are too stylized and a bunch of references that are too realistic, and you're like, I want exactly this. Oftentimes telling them what something is not is just as important as telling them as what it is. So you can do the same with references like, okay, so I want this to be like Lord of the Rings, but not like Aragon. So you've given them two different franchises that have very distinct styles, but they're both fantasy. So they have an understanding of, okay, I don't do this type of design, but I do want more of this. This can sometimes be more useful than just saying, I want it to be like Lord of the Rings, because one is also exclusionary. This is what I was talking about initially, which is the feedback pyramid. This is a very foundational way to structure your feedback, and it applies to most everything. It is very similar to how you work in scientific writing, right? Where you build your argument from the ground up. You want to do the same with feedback. Because if you think about it, feedback is an argument, but you're trying to just, instead of pushing your opinion on someone, you're trying to improve something together. So you want to gather as much data for your argument as possible, right? So you want to go and look at that delivery. Let's say they delivered that table, right? And that table is made from the wrong wood. So what wood is it made from? What parts of the piece would I want to circle that are like, okay, so this tells me why it's off. And this is the reference that I would like it to be. So now I have two pieces of data to solidify my argument. And I can go up and be like, okay, so this fits this time period better to my beliefs, right? To my main feedback from my wanted changes. And I point to the one data point with the reference I want, and I go like, okay, this is what I want it to be because it fits the time period better, it fits the color scheme we have better, anything like that. And you go to the other thing that you point and you're like, and this is the reasons why, because this and this and this looks off in this context. But then again, you've only told them what you don't like and what you want. You haven't told them how to get there. So your next part would be, can you go into Substance Painter? Can you go in, or if you don't have that material, can you go into Designer and make that material so we can use it in all of our assets, right? That's the first concrete takeaway for them to start on to implementing that feedback. And that honestly works with almost every context and almost every medium. The main important thing is that you make sure you explain exactly where you're coming from. You give them time to respond as well. A lot of the time, people have reasons for what they do, and they've thought a lot about it. And they will tell you something, you'll be like, you know what, you're right. This makes more sense the way you did it. Or you'll find a new, better solution together that's neither the one you wanted nor the one they wanted. I'm not saying that this is a sort of compromise, because in some way, creative projects are dictatorships. If you have a bunch of creative people on a team, if you always compromise, you're going to end up with a muddled product that doesn't look like anything you want, right? You got to have some guidelines, you got to have some person who has the last say, but you want to include people in the process as much as possible. So if they have an idea, it's worth exploring, even if it's not used in the end. This brings me to the most important point, in my opinion, about all of the stuff that I've talked about so far, is that I mentioned before that when you're asking someone to do something, you're usually not doing that because you can do it yourself. You're doing it either because you don't have the time to do it yourself or the expertise to do it yourself. So what you want to do is you want to give people the problem you have and then help them come up with a solution, right? You don't want to give them the exact solution if you don't know what you're talking about, especially. But if you can, figure out the solution with them together, because it makes them feel like they have a lot more agency in what they're doing. If I come to you and I'm like, okay, so I want this thing, but I want it exactly done this way. Even though you're the expert in your field, even if what I say is completely 100% right, you're not going to feel good. You're going to feel like I'm not respecting your expertise. You're going to feel like I'm not including you in the process. So that's one of the most important things to, especially if you're unsure, tell them what your problem is and work on a solution together. And honestly, the last point is just to ask questions. You would think that that is a completely self-explanatory point, but a lot of the time, in my experience, people don't ask for clarification. They don't ask at all. They will not come to you for feedback unless you haunt them. You literally go to them. And that is mostly because people always assume you're too busy. You don't want to bother you. So one thing to foster in a team from the very beginning and to just get into everyone's head is, and it's much more important we talk about this than you spend, let's say, a week, 2 weeks working on something that is not what we need, right? I always tell them that I would rather spend 2 hours on a call with you, figuring stuff out and pushing my other tasks to the back, because I'm management, right? I'm supposed to be talking to you. That's kind of part of my job. Then you spend 2 weeks of your time working on something we can't use or we have to heavily modify to use, because then we'll both have a problem. I will have less time available to do what we need to do, and you will basically feel like you wasted those 2 weeks. So that is honestly the main thing to keep in mind, because soft skills are not as reliably taught as hard skills. Most of the people you work with in the industry have a portfolio. That's why they get hired. They have enough soft skills to pass an interview. But depending on how they worked before, if they were freelancers, if they were in a small team and a big team, the way the company was managed before, they will not necessarily have that confidence to just go to their leader or to go to other team members and ask for what they need. So the other thing is to just be very proactive. It might feel weird, and I'm not saying go to people and give them unsolicited feedback. I'm saying just check in with people regularly and encourage them to seek what they need. Okay, I rushed through these. I realized that because I was about half as, I used about half the time I calculated I would need. But if you want me to go through anything again because I was too fast, if you have any questions, I'm happy to just be here.